The moment I set my badge on the conference table, the room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with courtesy. I hadn't planned for it to happen like that. I hadn't planned for any of it, really. Not the way my brother-in-law Marcus's face drained of color. Not the way my mother-in-law. Elaine's hand froze halfway to her water glass, and certainly not the way my husband, Fletcher, stared at me like he was seeing a stranger sitting in the chair where his wife used to be. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we got there. I married Fletcher Hale when I was 29 years old. He was charming, third-generation real estate money, and the kind of man who walked into a room and immediately started calculating what he was worth relative to everyone else in it. I didn't see that part clearly until much later. Love has a way of soft-focusing the things you should probably be looking at directly. His family operated Hale Property Group, a mid-sized commercial real estate firm based out of Charlotte, North Carolina. Fletcher, 41, served as VP of Acquisitions. His brother, Marcus, 38, ran operations. Their mother, Elaine Hale, 67, was chairman of the board in the way that certain women of a certain generation are chairmen, meaning she made every real decision and let the men believe they'd thought of it themselves. I worked in financial compliance. I'd spent 8 years at a federal regulatory agency before moving to a private consulting firm that contracted with the SEC and Treasury on fraud investigations. My title was Senior Investigative Analyst. My job, simplified, was to find the places in financial records where the numbers didn't add up, and then figure out who had made them not add up on purpose. I never talked about my work at Hale family dinners. Fletcher thought it was because I found it boring to explain. That wasn't it. The truth was that the Hales talked over me whenever I started a sentence that didn't circle back to something they already knew about. So I stopped starting sentences. I listened instead. Listening, it turned out, was a much more useful skill in that family anyway. The trouble began, or rather, the trouble became visible to me about 14 months before that conference room moment. I was home on a Tuesday afternoon, which was unusual. My firm had given us a half day for some building maintenance reason, and I'd come home to an empty house, or what I thought was an empty house. Fletcher's car wasn't in the driveway. I went upstairs to change and heard his voice through the closed door of his home office. I wasn't eavesdropping. I was walking down a hallway in my own home. She has no idea, Fletcher was saying. None. She files her little reports, comes home, asks about dinner. She's not going to be a problem. I stood very still outside that door. Marcus just needs to move the Brenton Street accounts before the quarter closes, he continued. Once the restructuring is finalized, there's no paper trail back to the initial transfer. Elaine already signed off. I didn't open the door. I turned around, went back downstairs, sat at the kitchen table, and made myself a cup of coffee. My hands were completely steady. That surprised me, looking back. But I think some part of my brain had already shifted into a mode I recognized from work. The mode where you don't react, you document. I called my office that evening from my car, parked 2 blocks from the house. Within 48 hours, I had confirmed 2 things. First, that I needed to recuse myself from any direct investigation because of my personal connection. Second, that what I'd heard described on the other sides of that door was a pattern of financial structuring that had the specific, identifiable shape of fraud. I handed it off to colleagues I trusted completely. I told them what I knew and where to look. Then I went home and made dinner and asked Fletcher how his day was. For 14 months, that is not a short amount of time to carry something like that. I want to be clear about that, because I think people assume it must have been satisfying, some long, elaborate performance of normalcy, while justice slowly assembled itself in the background. It wasn't satisfying. It was exhausting and lonely, and there were nights I sat in the bathroom, with the shower running, just to have somewhere that felt like mine. I grieved the marriage during those 14 months. I grieved it quietly, privately, the way you grieve something when you can't tell anyone what you've lost or why. What kept me steady was work. Not the investigation itself. I stayed entirely walled off from that, per protocol, but my own daily work, the rhythm of it, the way numbers either told the truth or they didn't. I found that comforting. In the rest of my life, things were murky and painful and complicated. In my work, things were knowable. The other thing that helped was understanding, clearly, what the Hales thought of me. About 3 months in, Fletcher and I attended a dinner at Elaine's house, the big one in Myers Park, the one she'd had hosted every month for 30 years, like a minor feudal lord holding court. Marcus was there with his wife, Priscilla 40, who smiled at me the way some people smile at furniture they're planning to replace. Elaine's estate attorney, a man named Douglas, who wore bow ties and spoke entirely in subtext, was also present. At some point during the second course, when I'd stepped away from the table to refresh my drink, I came back to hear Elaine saying my name. "Lydia is simply not in a position to understand what we're managing here," she said, her voice carrying the particular clarity of someone who has never once worried about being overheard. "She's a government employee at heart. She thinks in terms of rules. This family thinks in terms of outcomes. She's Fletcher's problem," Marcus said. "We just need her not to be our problem." I walked back to my chair, sat down, and asked Douglas how his summer had been. I didn't look at Fletcher. I didn't need to. The silence on his side of the table told me everything. Lydia is simply not in a position to understand. I filed that sentence away, the same place I filed everything else during those 14 months. Evidence is only useful if you keep it somewhere you can find it again. The charity gala was Elaine's idea. It always was. Hale Property Group had for years sponsored a table at the Carolina Corporate Philanthropic Forum, a black-tie dinner held each spring at the Belk Theater in Uptown Charlotte, attended by about 400 people. Developers, investors, city officials, the kind of civic-minded wealthy who like to be photographed next to large checks. The firm bought a table of 10. The table was always the same: Elaine, Fletcher, Marcus, Priscilla, Douglas the attorney, 2 board members, and a rotating cast of clients and partners. I had attended exactly once, 2 years into the marriage. That year, Elaine had introduced me to a city council member. As Fletcher's wife, she works for the government in some capacity. I'd smiled. I'd shaken the council member's hand. I had not corrected her. This year, 6 weeks before the gala, Fletcher told me over breakfast that Elaine had decided to restructure the table and had given my seat to a property developer from Raleigh who was potentially interested in partnering on their new downtown project. "You understand," Fletcher said, not looking up from his phone. "It's a business decision." "Of course," I said. "You never really enjoyed those things anyway." "I really didn't," I said, which was true. He looked up then briefly, with the expression of someone who'd expected resistance and wasn't sure what to do with its absence. "You're fine with it?" "Completely," I said. I was. I had known for 3 weeks that I would be attending the gala, regardless of whether I had a seat at the Hale table. My firm's managing partner, Catherine Ossie, had personally requested my presence as her guest. Catherine was one of 12 people in the state of North Carolina who knew exactly what had been unfolding over the previous 14 months. She had also, as it happened, coordinated with the U.S. Attorney's Office to ensure that 2 federal agents would be present at the gala that evening, seated at a table near the east exit, dressed in evening wear. "The timing," Catherine had told me, "is going to be either perfect or it's going to be a disaster, and I think you should be the one in the room when we find out which." I wore navy. I had my hair done. I took a car service downtown, arrived at the Belk Theater at 7:15, and handed my name card to the volunteer at the check-in table. She found it in the system, looked up, and said, "Mrs. Caldwell, you're at table 3. Table 3 was 3 rows from the stage. The Hale table was table 11, near the back. I didn't look for them. I didn't need to. I found out later. From Priscilla, of all people, who called me 11 days after everything happened and talked for 40 minutes in the way that people talk when they've been holding something too long. That Fletcher had noticed me when the program started. That he'd leaned over to Marcus and said something. That Marcus had said, "She's probably just here with someone from work, ignore it." That they had ignored it. Right up until the moment they couldn't. The forum's keynote speaker that year was a woman named Dr. Sandra Reeves from UNC's Business School, and she spoke for about 25 minutes on ethical leadership in real estate development, which, given what was about to happen, had a certain quality to it that I suspect she didn't intend. I sat at table 3 and listened politely and watched the second hand on my watch. At 8:42, my phone buzzed once. It was a text from Catherine, sitting at the table to my left. "It's confirmed. They're moving now." I set my phone face down on the table and folded my hands in my lap. What happened next took about minutes. I know because I counted. 2 men in dark suits entered through the side corridor. They moved without hurrying, which is something I've noticed about people who are very good at what they do. They never look like they're rushing, even when the situation is urgent. They reached table 11. One of them said something I couldn't hear from where I was sitting. I watched Marcus stand up, slowly, with the look of a man whose mind is running through exits and finding all of them blocked. Fletcher sat very still. Elaine did not stand at all. She simply looked across the room, not at the agents, not at Marcus, but directly at me. I met her eyes. I did not look away. She looked away first. There was a brief, contained disruption at table 11, the kind that gets noticed but doesn't spread. A few people at neighboring tables craned their necks. A server paused with a tray. Someone near the stage leaned over and whispered to their companion. Within 90 seconds, Marcus had been quietly escorted out the side corridor. Fletcher had followed, less quietly. Elaine remained seated for another 3 minutes before Douglas appeared at her elbow and they walked out together through the main entrance. The keynote speaker had already concluded. The room shifted into the award presentation portion of the program. A man at the podium began announcing the first honoree. Catherine leaned over from her table. "You okay?" she asked. I thought about that for a second. "Yeah," I said. "I actually am." People ask me sometimes, friends, my sister, my therapist, whether I felt vindicated in that moment, whether watching them walk out of that room felt like the ending I'd been waiting for. The honest answer is that it felt quieter than I expected. There was no rush of triumph. It wasn't like a movie. It was more like the sensation of setting down something very heavy that you've been carrying for so long you'd forgotten what it felt like to have your hands free. What followed was not quiet, of course. The U.S. Attorney's Office had spent 11 months building a case that, by the time it reached indictment, included wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy charges against Fletcher, Marcus, and 3 associates at the firm. The core of it was a scheme to divert funds from a commercial development trust through a series of shell transfers. The Brenton Street accounts I'd heard Fletcher mention through that closed door, in a way that defrauded both investors and a municipal affordable housing partnership the firm had contracted with. Roughly $4.2 million had moved through the structure over 3 years. Elaine was not charged. This surprised some people. It didn't surprise me. Elaine was very careful about what she signed and what she simply understood without signing. That carefulness, it turned out, was the one genuinely intelligent thing anyone in that family had done. She lost the firm regardless. When your 2 principal officers are under federal indictment, your investors leave, your partners distance themselves, and your board dissolves with a speed that has its own kind of eloquence. Hale Property Group filed for bankruptcy protection 4 months after the gala. Fletcher and I had been living separately since the night of the gala. I had moved into a furnished apartment the following morning, which I'd rented 3 weeks in advance because I knew how that evening was going to end. The divorce proceedings were complicated in the way that divorce proceedings involving federal asset freezes tend to be complicated. But I had a good attorney and a clear understanding of what was mine and what wasn't. My name had never appeared on any of the business accounts. Fletcher had told me once, early in our marriage, that it was cleaner to keep finances separate, that it was how his family had always operated. I had thought, at the time, that this was a red flag. I had married him anyway. I do not have a fully satisfying explanation for that decision, except to say that 29-year-olds sometimes marry people they shouldn't, and that the outcome of that mistake does not have to define the rest of your life. The thing I think about most, looking back, is that Tuesday afternoon, the half day, the empty house, the voice coming through the closed office door. I think about what would have happened if I'd had a different kind of job. If I hadn't known what the shape of fraud looked like, hadn't known who to call, hadn't known exactly how to hand something off without compromising the investigation or myself. If I'd been, as Elaine put it, a government employee at heart who thought in terms of rules. She was right that I thought in terms of rules. She was wrong that it made me powerless. Rules, applied correctly, are the most precise instrument of consequence that exists. They don't require anger. They don't require confrontation. They don't require you to explain yourself to people who have already decided not to listen. They just require patience and documentation. And, occasionally, a navy dress and a seat at table 3. Priscilla, Marcus's wife, filed for divorce 2 weeks after the indictments came down. I don't blame her. She called me, as I mentioned, about a month after everything, and we talked for a long time. She said she hadn't known. I told her I believed her. I think I did believe her, mostly. She asked me, near the end of the conversation, how I had managed to keep it together for all those months. How I had sat across from Fletcher at dinner and not said anything, had gone to Elaine's monthly gatherings, had smiled at Marcus, had let them all believe I was the unremarkable, uncomprehending wife they decided I was. I thought about how to answer that honestly. I think, I said, that people who underestimate you give you a gift they don't mean to give you. They stop watching. They stop being careful. They just hand you everything you need. Priscilla was quiet for a moment. Marcus used to say, "You were the least interesting person at those dinners," she said. I know, I said. He was so wrong about that. I know that too, I said. Fletcher pled guilty to 1 count of wire fraud and 1 count of money laundering 9 months after the indictment. The plea agreement carried a sentencing recommendation of 4 to 6 years. Marcus went to trial, which his attorney presumably advised against, and was convicted on all counts. He received 7 years. On the day Fletcher was sentenced, I was in a conference room in Washington, D.C., presenting findings to a joint task force on commercial real estate fraud patterns. I had been asked to join the task force 6 months earlier, which was a different kind of acknowledgement than the one I'd imagined during those long, quiet months in Charlotte, but in some ways a more meaningful one. My phone buzzed during a break between presentations. It was my sister, texting me the news from the courthouse. I read it. I put my phone away. I went back into the room. The work was waiting. The work is always waiting. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like exactly the right place to be.